And we're live. At least I think we're live. I hope we're live. My name is Scott Kennedy, and we're going to be talking a lot of NFL draft over the course of the next 2 months. But first, I want to take care of a little bit of business. If you're watching this after the fact, or if you're just joining us live, two things. One, please hit that subscribe button. That's a big help to me and lets me do more of these and bring in more big guests like the one we got today. And two, if you've got any comments or questions or anything like that, please interact. It makes us so much more fun. The Q&A is one of my favorite things to do. That way we know we're talking about what you want to talk about instead of, we're just monologuing here or having a conversation. We can do that on the phone. If you're watching this after the fact, hit the comments. We will absolutely answer after. I answer them all week long. So hit the comments too. Interact today, hit the comments afterwards. We would love to hear from you. We're going to be talking Notre Dame football prospects. There are as many as 10 Notre Dame college football players that could be in the NFL draft, and I'll be surprised if it's not at least 7. I think 7 is a safe over-under. So including a couple high-round picks and some very good players here. And it's important to me to, in the process of scouting and looking at these guys, is to find out and talk to the people who see them every day. Who's covering them every day? Who's not just looking at highlights? I'll see guys at the Senior Bowl and I'll say, listen, this is what I see from the Senior Bowl or the Combine or from highlights, and I will quantify and qualify that statement with that's what I know. But you absolutely want to go a little bit deeper and find out what you see from the guys that cover them every day. Not just their highlights, but their lowlights. What do they like to interact with every day? All that stuff's important. They're investing a lot of money into these players. You want to know what they're like as teammates and that type of stuff as well. So with that, I want to bring in Bryan Driskell of IrishBreakdown.com. And Bryan's been covering Notre Dame for several years. We've known each other for a couple of years already, and I really enjoy his. I don't think there's an accident in the name Irish Breakdown when he's talking about breaking down film and all these players and so on. So if you just want to tell us a little bit about yourself, Bryan, then we'll start talking Notre Dame football.
Yeah, I was a college football coach for about 7 years and then got into doing this. I've been covering Notre Dame's the only team I've been able to cover. Started off and on from 2007, took a little hiatus to coach college football for a couple more years. And then, of course, since 2014, I've been back to covering Notre Dame, and I've been running Irish Breakdown now. We just completed our second season covering Notre Dame for Irish Breakdown. We have a podcast, and we just launched our YouTube channel as well. So we're dipping our toe into the YouTube thing. But, of course, really exciting time to be covering, obviously, the draft. Notre Dame's got, I counted 12 guys that have a chance to get drafted. I don't think it'll be that many. And then, of course, spring ball's right around the corner. That's the great thing about March. March means spring ball's right around the corner. So that's going to be interesting to see how that goes for Notre Dame. But, as they kind of build on what they've done the last 4 years, and we're going to find out if they can kind of take that next step as a program.
I remember, Bryan, I've been doing the team site stuff for a long, long time. People say, what do you do in the offseason? I'm like, what off
What's an offseason?
what offseason?
I'm usually more busy during the offseason than I am during the regular season.
Exactly. The recruiting's 12 months a year, just that alone. Welcome. We got a bunch of people popping in. Hit those comments. We would love to hit your questions, and we'll feature them, and we'll answer them here with me and Bryan. And I can get big picture information on some of these guys and what I see as an outsider looking in. And Bryan's going to help us take a look at some of these Notre Dame guys from a perspective of covering them on a day-to-day basis. He's going to see the highs and the lows. We show highlights. We want to talk lowlights. And Bryan, frankly, that's one of my favorite things about talking NFL prospects versus college football recruiting. You get to be a little more honest. You get to talk a little bit more honest about them. I still can't do it quite as brutally as some of these guys, just, coming from so long. But, that you never talk about what's bad. You just say what they can improve on. He's not small. I just like seeing him bigger. He's not slow. He just needs to get faster. That type of stuff. And then towards the end, if there's 12 guys that can get drafted, that's a lot of people that need to be replaced. So, Bryan, we'll give a little bit of a preview for 2021 Notre Dame when we get to the end. So if you're here for Notre Dame football 2021, just go ahead and skip to the end of this when you're rewatching because that's what we'll talk about towards the end. But right off the bat, one of the best college football players, and I want to talk to you about how he's going to translate to the pros, is Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, linebacker, safety? I mean, he's 6'1", 215 pounds. That's an average size safety in the NFL, but just playmaker extraordinaire. 11 tackles for losses, 3 interceptions. You see him in coverage. You see him all over the place. Is he as good every day as he is when we see him on tape, when we're watching him in this type of environment?
Absolutely. I mean, he's one of the most impactful linebackers Notre Dame. I mean, you look at, does he have the God-given ability of Jalen Smith? No. Did he have the size and power of Manti Te'o? No. But from a production standpoint, he's just as impactful as Notre Dame has had. He had 11 tackles for loss this year. And the thing is, Scott, when you break down Notre Dame's film, they're avoiding him. Teams are avoiding him. They're purposely trying to game plan away from him because he is the rover. He's almost exclusively a field defender. And in college football, with the hashes a little wider, it's easier to defend. It's easier to avoid a field player because you kind of know where he's going to be. And he was still able to have the level of production he had. Last season in 2019, he had 13 and a half tackles for loss. So, and he's really only been a 2-year player. And the other thing people have to keep in mind about Jeremiah, he was 17 until November of his freshman year. So he's still a very young player. He's still a very young defender. He turned, I think the first week of his freshman year in 2017, he turned 18. So this is a very young defender. He's a very instinctive defender. He can do so many different things. And, we talk about, is he a safety? Is he a linebacker? I think he's the perfect modern day second level defender. Because in today's era of positionless football with some of these teams, and even if you're not someone who subscribes to the positionless football mantra, what we all know, which is just a fact because it's in the data, is in the NFL, teams are minimum 60% of the game in sub packages. So if you can find a defender that can play in space, can play against the run, that you don't have to sub out on first or second down or in third down in pass situations, then that guy's going to be a premium player. And Jeremiah Owusu is that kind of player. He can run with slots. He can run with backs and tight ends, obviously. And even though he's only 6'1", he's incredibly long. And Scott, you've been doing this a long time. There's 6'3" guys that are not 6'3" because they have shorter arms. And there's
Short
those
necks.
and there's like those Elvis Dumervilles and those Aaron Donalds who are shorter players but have incredible arm length where they actually play like a much bigger defender. So that's Jeremiah. He's got that length. He's got that suddenness. And the size is a concern in regards to if you're going to ask him to be a box linebacker, then that's not what you need. That's not what you're looking for. He's not going to take on guards all game and lock him off his body and disengage, get to the ball. But in space, he can play the run because the thing that's unique about him is even though he's only 210 to 215 pounds and it kind of varies, his ability to take 3 steps and explode through a ball carrier is impressive. And that's just that lower body power and explosiveness that doesn't really have to do with your size. It's just your God-given ability. And he's that kind of guy that can just take 3 steps and just drill you. And we saw that against Florida State this year. He was going in one direction and just took 3 steps in another direction and just lays the running back out. So he's a very unique, special player, and as good of a football player he is, he can match that from a character standpoint.
And that's great because you don't want to see. I did a story on allfalcons.com about Julio Jones and the other players that have 250-yard games. It's like Antonio Brown, Josh Gordon. Put those guys over here and give me Julio. But the thing that still I can't wrap my head around in the day of holdbacks and double holdbacks is a 17-year-old senior. See, I worry about this. My son is going to be graduating at 17 years old, and I'm worried he's going up against guys like Calvin Ridley, who, when he enrolled at Alabama, was 20. He turned 20 December of his senior season, and my son will be, 24, 32 months younger than this guy, competing for scholarships at the same level. Come on now. So, but if you really like this guy early on, you've got him for an extra 3 years of his career. I think that's amazing.
Yeah, and he also doesn't have a lot of wear and tear on his body. He redshirted as a freshman in 2017. In 2018, he was going to be a key contributor on defense, sort of a rotation player at Rover, and then also was going to play a lot of special teams. Hurt his foot in the opener and redshirted. Didn't play the rest of the year. So the last 2 years is the first we've seen him.
Well, and a trendy pick for him right now seems to be in that 18 to 20 spot. I've seen the Raiders. And then I've seen the Dolphins as part of a trade down package. So in a lot of these mocks. So that could be something to keep an eye on with him. Now, it sounds like you're as high on him as he shows. He shows great on video. His measurables can be a little questionable, but is that a problem? And that might keep him in the teens instead of in the top 10, like Micah Parsons, who's 6'2", 245 pounds. Big deal. Is that that big a difference? Maybe it might be. We'll see. Another guy coming down, and I read your article about one of the mock drafts, and I thought it was very interesting. A stat that Notre Dame should be flying on a billboard about left tackles, and that Liam Eichenberg, if he falls out of the first round, would be the only offensive tackle not drafted in the first round, left tackle not drafted in the first round under Brian Kelly. That's incredible.
It's an 11-year stretch.
That's incredible. I mean, that's not missing. I mean, I think of Iowa when I think of guys like that, and they're getting 3-star guys who are 245-pound tight ends and turn them into first-round offensive tackles. But I think that's amazing. Now, tell me why Liam Eichenberg should be in the first round, and tell me why he might drop into the second.
I'll go reverse order if you don't mind. I think the reason he might drop into the second is because he's not an elite athlete, and I think there's an obsession in the scouting community right now about that. He doesn't have this great lateral quickness. People say I think that's a little overplayed. I mean, look, I've seen him go against Josh Kando and Rashad Weaver and Chris Rumpf and Victor Dimukeje and Patrick Jones. I mean, he's been battle tested. This is a guy that's going against the best of the best on a consistent basis and winning and holding his own. I think his length helps him overcome any lack of, lateral quickness he might have. I think he handles change of direction well. I think he's a guy that handles double moves very well, and he's got very powerful, heavy hands. And I think that's very important for a left tackle. And, I look at a guy like Tevin Jenkins from Oklahoma State, for example, and I see a guy that's a little bit better athlete than Liam Eichenberg, but I see also a guy with a lot shorter arms than Liam Eichenberg. I see a guy that lacks the 38-game experience that Liam Eichenberg brings to the table. And you're talking about a kid. Go back and look at Notre Dame's schedule the last 3 years since he's been in the starting lineup. So he's a 38-game starter. The last time he gave up a sack was September 29th of 2018. That was his 5th career start against Stanford. He hasn't given up a sack since then, and he's played against, as I said, some very good players. He's smart. He's a strong, and his run blocking has developed over the years. In his 2020 season, I graded out better than Mike McGlinchey's 2017 season, and I graded out better than Ronnie Stanley's 2015 season. I think what's happening with Liam Eichenberg is he's kind of fallen victim to the Zach Martin disease when he was at Notre Dame. Zach Martin was not an All-American. He was a 4-year starter at Notre Dame. He began that first-round stretch. It was Zach Martin, followed by Ronnie Stanley, followed by Mike McGlinchey. For me, I think that Liam Eichenberg projects better to the National Football League than Mike McGlinchey did. Mike McGlinchey was a dominant, powerful run blocker, but he was never a great pass blocker at Notre Dame. And we're now seeing that in the NFL. That's the thing that's hurting him in the NFL is he's just not a great pass blocker. I think Liam Eichenberg is an excellent pass blocker that doesn't have the flashy plays of some of these other first-round picks, but he's just going to get the job done game after game, snap after snap. And as a former quarterback, give me the non-flashy guy that's never going to get me hit over the really athletic, flashy guy that you hope pans out. Give me a guy that's going to be a plug-and-play like Liam Eichenberg over a Garrett Bowles, who the light eventually went on, but it wasn't until year 4. That's the kind of thing I'm looking for. Is this is a guy that can be a starting left or right tackle from you the day he steps foot, in your building. And there's a lot of value to that, in my opinion.
Yeah, and when you're talking about, I almost feel like these days that running is a scheme, whereas the NFL is moving more and more to passing league. Period. You have to protect the quarterback, number one. That's why the left tackle has been for years the second highest paid player in the NFL behind the quarterback. You've got to be able to protect him. So if he's out there protecting the quarterback, he's going to be a pretty good pro. Now, you mentioned a couple things that I thought was interesting as far as being in that spot for a long time at left tackle, being successful there at left tackle. Let's go to the guy he has been protecting the blind side of a little bit, and I want to talk a little bit about Ian Book. When you look at the resume, so to speak, let's forget what the film is, which I never do, but let's look at the resume. and you look at second all-time leading passer in the history of Notre Dame. This is Notre Dame we're talking about. I know we're not talking about air raids in Texas Tech and Houston or anything like that, but it's Notre Dame. They've had some quarterbacks. Second all-time leading passer, and most importantly, he's got the most wins in the history of Notre Dame. The most wins. Notre Dame's been playing football, 130 years, 140 years? Some Heisman Trophy winners, some national championship guys, and he's got the most wins of the bunch. Now, I watch him and don't know any of this stuff, and I think, maybe an undrafted guy maybe sneaks into day 3 and as a backup. Now, am I wrong on the evaluation? Is he just David Green? If you remember, David Green was a
Georgia, yeah.
And I said the same thing about Colt McCoy, but Colt was, I think, a better runner and maybe just a shade taller. Colt McCoy was a fantastic college quarterback. I didn't like him for the NFL.
Mm-hmm.
And he got bumped up second, third round up in that notch. I was like, no, he's undersized and underarmed. That's a bad combination for a high round pick. That's what I see in Ian Book. Am I wrong?
No, I don't think so. I think Liam Book was a solid college quarterback who played at Notre Dame during a time when the fact of the matter is they weren't challenged as much as they used to be. I'll give you a stat, right? So there's this info. Well, he's second all time in passing yards, and that to me is just as much about being from a longevity standpoint as it is just raw production. He's not in there.
Notre Dame recruits. So how come they haven't recruited somebody that's been able to come and beat him out?
Well,
that's the other part of it.
I would say, I think that's coach's choice more than it is not having a player. Anyone that watched Phil Dracovic this year, honestly, with an open mind and objective, said, "How come that kid's not playing at Notre Dame right now?" Mm-hmm. So I think that was more of Liam ran the type of offense they want to run, which is protect the football, just be conservative, ball control. Get the ball where it's supposed to go, offense. And it was rely on your O-line, rely on your run game, and rely on the fact you've got one of the best defenses in the country. That's not Phil Dracovic's game. Phil Dracovic is more of a playmaker, doing things outside the box and all those types of things in the pass game, and they made the choice, for whatever reason, right or wrong, to stick with Ian Book. But the game has changed too, and Notre Dame was never a team that was known for throwing the football. And, Tony Rice was a Heisman runner-up in 1990 or 1989, he threw 2 touchdown passes. He threw 9 interceptions.
1,000 yards passing was
yeah. And so,
now you're talking my era. Those are my guys. I try not to go.
The game has changed. And look, Ian Book has done a great job. The 30-5 is impressive, but he's 5-5 against opponents that finished ranked in the top 25. 5-5. Tony Rice's record in 88 and 89, just those 2 seasons, he was 11-1 against teams that finished in the top 25. So.
It seems to me most of those top 25 teams that they're playing are usually top 10 in at the end of the season. Playoff games, bowl games, or are they getting, because
it's about half.
To me, 10 games against top 25. That's an SEC schedule.
Yeah, but that's over 3 years.
Yeah. Okay.
Where Tony Rice played 12 in 2 years. And you look at who they beat. So that he beat Northwestern. That was a team that finished a 9-5 top 25 team. Syracuse, Navy, North Carolina, and then Clemson, right? Now, the Clemson game this year was a big win. And you could thank Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah for that one because he basically gifted the offense 10 points on back-to-back possessions. But then you look at the losses. Blowout loss to Alabama, 2 blowout losses to Clemson, games in which they scored 3, 10, and 14 points, and 2 of their 3 touchdowns in those games came in late in the fourth quarter with the game in doubt. They scored 17 points against Georgia last year. So it's not even like they're losing these games in competitive fashion. The fact is the offense just isn't anywhere close to being good enough in those games. And Ian Book is a gritty, tough kid. He's a great leader. I think that he is a guy that I could see sticking in the NFL as a Chase Daniel kind of guy, not someone you ever necessarily want to be your starter. If you're a team that's got an established young to middle of aged sort of NFL quarterback, and you're just looking for a guy to be a backup that can go in and get you out of a game if you need be, he's a guy that I would look at because the character's there. He's going to show up and work every day. He's going to have a good attitude. All those kind of things you want in a backup quarterback. He's not going to be raising heck about why am I not starting over, Pat Mahomes, right? He says, hey, what's my job? What am I going to do? He's a great teammate. So in those regards, I think there's some things to like. And the fact he has played on the big stage a lot. I mean, when you're at Notre Dame, you're playing Duke on national TV, right? I mean, nobody else really does that except maybe Alabama. So I think there's some things to like about him if you're just looking for a pure backup quarterback in a year that I don't think is great at quarterback from a depth standpoint. Very good at the top, but once you get past like 8, 9, I just don't see a lot there that I like, whereas at least with Ian Book, you know what you're getting. But, you know, the stats and all those kind of things, I don't put a lot in that because Notre Dame didn't start throwing the football until Charlie Weiss showed up. Right. And Jimmy Clausen left after his junior year. If Jimmy Clausen comes back for his senior year, Ian Book is not sniffing Jimmy Clausen's numbers, you know? Yeah. So,
you know, Jimmy Clausen got some, now we're off topic just a little bit, but, you know, I like talking, you know, this type of stuff is, you know, when was it Steve Clarkson calls Jimmy Clausen the LeBron James of high school football, you know, that's hype. That's ridiculous. But Jimmy Clausen was the #1 player in the country. And people, he was a bust. I'm like, by what standards was he a bust? Look at his numbers in college. He was a really good at Notre Dame.
Here's the thing, too. You have to look at, Scott. It's all about winning and losing, right? And Jimmy Clausen played on bad teams, not because of Jimmy Clausen. I mean, the only reason they were in half the games they won were because of Jimmy Clausen.
Now, did he live up to that hype? No one was going to live up to that hype.
No, right.
Lives up to that hype. It's a different sport.
The closest I've ever seen is Trevor Lawrence. I mean, Trevor Lawrence is the closest I've seen to a #1 player that lived up to that #1 hype from the moment he stepped foot on campus. But there's a reason Trevor Lawrence is Trevor Lawrence. Most guys aren't like that. Jimmy Clausen was also 20 when he was a freshman at Notre Dame. So
the double holdbacks.
Right. To your point, though, Jimmy Clausen threw 28 touchdowns and 4 picks on a bum foot as a junior at Notre Dame. He just played on a bad team. And
I said we were going to do this at the end, but as we were talking about some of those losses to some of those teams, now this sounds like a stupid question, but people have done a lot of stupid things through the course of the years. So you were talking about blowout losses, and it's those teams that you're going to meet at the end of the season, right? It's Alabama. It's Clemson. It's the teams that you're going to – if it's Ohio State, it's the teams in the top 5 that Notre Dame is going to need to take that next step if they're going to win a championship. Is there any heat at all on Brian Kelly? Is there any discussion where they're like, this is as far as this guy's going to take us? Or is he – because when you're winning, his attitude and gruffness is charming. When you're getting whipped, it becomes grating. So is there any time – I mean – I know. That's why I said, what was he, 10-0 this year, 11-0?
Right, 10-0 regular season, and then right.
But, you know, like I said, we've seen stupid stuff. I saw a coach at Alabama get fired after 11-1. You know, I think, you know, that was Bill Curry. We've seen crazy things happen. Is there anything crazy going on at Notre Dame where there's any chatter about this is as far as this guy's going to take us, or is he as safe? Is he there right now as long as he wants to be?
On my channel, yes, you are hearing some of that. On other channels, no. I think Notre Dame was so mediocre to bad for so long that they're just excited that they don't suck anymore. It's kind of like, we don't suck anymore, you know, from what was it, Waterboy, right? And so you look at it and you say, hey, you know, they are going 10-2. Yeah, we can't beat Bama. Well, you know, of course you can't beat Bama. They pay players. They do this. They do that, as if like that didn't exist in the 80s, 70s, and 60s, right? You know, but I think the fact that Brian Kelly has developed a level of, well, at least we're beating everybody else. Here's the crazy stat for you, Scott. And I'm trying to pull this off the top of my head. I wrote about this a week ago. If you look at 2015 and then 2017 to now, so the last 5 years in Notre Dame's had 10+ win seasons, they've gone 51-0 against teams that finish unranked. Now, that's an impressive level consistency. I mean, the fact that, you know, he's got them to the point where they're not losing to Tulsa anymore. They're not losing to Navy anymore. They're not losing at home to Syracuse anymore like they did back in the day.
Newsmakers in there. You know, when Notre Dame loses to an unranked opponent, it's national news.
Right. And it's not happening anymore.
I never got this. You know, living in this, I grew up in Atlanta. I went to an SEC school. I grew up in the South. And I grew up in the 80s and 90s in here. And, you know, Notre Dame had like one good season in there, but they never won a championship basically in my lifetime. And everybody's like, what, Scott, what's the big deal about Notre Dame? And I didn't get it until I moved to California. And I'm out there listening to the radio and it says, up next, we've got highlights from USC, UCLA, and Notre Dame. I'm like, wait a minute, what? What are you talking about? I was like, okay, now I get it. Now it makes sense because, you know, down south, they talk Southern football a lot.
Right.
So
well, they have won a championship in your lifetime. They won one in '88.
Yes, I
with Coach
remember.
Holtz. Yes,
I
and
was
they
15.
should have won one in 1993, but that could be a whole different podcast. So they did beat the national champs that year.
Well,
so.
I was in school with the only undefeated team in 1993, so we don't want to talk about that. There was only one 11-0 team.
Weren't you guys on probation back then? I think. I don't know.
Yep. But, somehow another team on probation got a share of a national championship in a 3-year window there. But the old joke, what happens when the NCAA calls on Alabama, Auburn goes on probation. That was how it worked at the time. What did I wanted to talk? Oh, the analogy I wanted to make on you, speaking of Atlanta, was the Braves. The Braves were so bad, and this isn't, Notre Dame wasn't that bad for that long.
Mm-hmm.
The Braves were awful. That if you grew up in the 80s, you were okay with the Braves winning 100 games and losing in the playoffs. You're like, listen, I remember what it was like. After 20 years of that, okay, that becomes a little bit different. So we circle back. Now we're running a little short on time. Quick thoughts on Daelin Hayes. I loved him at the Senior Bowl. I look at his stat. He bounces around. He had that 7 on him, which makes him look smaller anyway. And then out there, 6'3.5", 260 pounds, lining up as a stand-up outside linebacker and putting his hand down as a defensive end. People are talking 5th round, 4th round. Why? Why isn't he thought about it being higher than that?
I think it's just a lack of production. I think is a big thing. He really didn't become the full-time starter until this season. He was in a rotation with Julio Jones. He was coming off the bench with Julio Jones for a while, and obviously Julio Jones was a 3rd-round pick of the Lions last year. And I think the big thing too is you talk about offensively, it's about passing the football and protecting the quarterback. Well, on defense, if you're a front 7 guy, can you get after the quarterback? And Daelin Hayes has never really been a guy that was a high-volume pass disruptor. He was a guy that could drop into coverage, could cover slots, could cover tight ends, backs, great run defender. So I think had he been more productive in the pass game as a pass rusher, I think we'd be talking about him more. And I think the other thing too is just this is a kid that hadn't played a lot of football. He didn't play a lot of high school football for different reasons, not his fault. Came to Notre Dame, has been part of a really deep. Notre Dame's 2018 defensive line is going to have 4 defensive ends that are going to get drafted. And then Jerry Tillery at defensive tackle, who was a 1st-round pick. I mean, so he was kind of masked behind a lot of guys that are older than him or in his grade who are NFL football players. So I think he's a guy that as long as the medicals check out, I think he's a guy that some team is going to get a steal if they get him in the 5th or 6th round. Because, again, in this era of substitution football, you have a guy that's capable of putting his hand in the ground and being a run defender pass rusher, but also a guy that's capable of standing up and covering a tight end, dropping into coverage, being a 3-down player that you can move around. Guys like that are incredibly valuable in today's NFL where you only have a certain number of spots on your roster and then you're doing all these sub packages. Can you find defenders that can really be 3-4 down players? And Daelin Hayes, to me, is one of those guys. If he has a big pro day, if he runs and tests the way that I think he's gonna run and test, I think there's going to be people that are like, well, let me go back and look at that 2018 film. Let me go back and look at that 2017 film. Because the thing is, he's been a 4-year player at Notre Dame. He would have been gone last year if he doesn't get hurt against Virginia. He was a guy that started as a freshman, was a key rotation player and sort of a co-starter for 2 years with Julio Jones, and then this year kind of broke out. So I think if he tests well, there's going to be a lot deeper dive in his film from a lot of different people.
And Daelin Hayes, to me, sounds like the ultimate sleeper. Are the tools there as he put it all together? And is it a motor thing? Is it some injuries or what is
I think it's just usage. I think just how he was used. He was never used as a guy. And this is fine. I think the way they used him is they had a Swiss Army knife and they used him as such. And so to have a 265-pound guy that can be a great run defender, set the edge, play on the backside, can drop into coverage and run with wheel routes, can run with tight ends and backs, use him that way. And so they did a great job of utilizing him as a versatile player. And then you have Julio Jones, who's more of just a pass rusher. Well, use him to your strengths. It was an example of good coaches saying, what do my guys do well? And let's use it that way. And so that's really what I think it is. It helped the Notre Dame defense. It might have hurt Daelin Hayes' draft stock, but it helped the Notre Dame defense.
And that's okay. They're making millions and millions of dollars as coaches to win football games, not to win somebody's draft stock. So that actually, I promise I didn't lead you this way on purpose, but that led me to one of my 2 final questions for you before I let you go. March 31st, pro day for Notre Dame. other than Daelin Hayes, who we just spoke about, who can help themselves the most? Because it looks to me like there's two guys in Eichenberg and Owusu-Koramoah who are first, second round picks. And the other guy, then there's a drop. So what's it going to take? Who can help themselves the most at Pro Day coming up at the end of the month?
I think two guys that could help them, Aaron Banks and Robert Hainsey, to me, are day two players that with good testing will jump into that mix. I think the two guys more than anybody that have the best chance to do damage at Pro Day is number one, Tommy Trumbull. Tommy Tremble was very underutilized as a tight end at Notre Dame. He was a guy.
This is Robert. While we're listening to you,
Yeah.
Bryan, this is Hainsey coming out of. This is actually it's him firing out of there from the interior line.
He to me is a day two player that was overshadowed by other great players in that line. And we talk about Robert Hainsey. He can play guard, he can play center, and he can play right tackle in a pinch. He is going to start in the NFL for a long time. Tommy Tremble's a guy that sat behind Cole Kmet, second round pick. Then this year, he has the best freshman season from a Notre Dame tight end in history under Michael Mayer, who was a 5-star recruit. I think he's just kind of a victim of circumstance. But you talk about a 6'3.5", close to 6'4" player. He ran a 4.63 coming out of Georgia as a junior in high school. He's going to test off the charts, and he's a very athletic player, and he's a punishing blocker. When teams see how athletic he is, I think he's going to if he tests the way that I think he's going to test, which is low 4.6, maybe a high 4.5. He's a guy that I think is another one that people are going to say, let's do a deeper dive into his film, because he's a very athletic player, good pass catcher. He's just got to be more consistent, more focused. When he drops balls, it's those easy balls, that he shouldn't be dropping. But to me, he's one of the 3 or 4 most physically gifted tight ends in this draft. He just doesn't have the production of some of those other players.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan. I remind people how old I am all the time. But I grew up with the dynasties of the 49ers and the Cowboys, and they ran pro sets or eyes, big fullback, big tight end, and you see how effective a tight end is when he gets into the secondary. They wreak havoc, and frankly, it's fun. It's fun watching a 260-pound guy with the ball in his hands try and get tackled by 200-pound defensive backs. It's fun. It might not be all that safe for the defensive backs, but I think the tight end has made a comeback here in recent years. Thanks, Gronkowski and the like, and Jimmy Graham and that group. But Tony Gonzalez, Brett Irvin, Jay Novacek, those are the guys I grew up with, and it's just why isn't the tight end more useful? And I kind of joke.
I do think you're seeing that come back, though. I mean, you're seeing George Kittles, you're seeing these guys, you're seeing now tight ends going in the top 10. Kyle Pitts, in my opinion, is going to be a top 10 pick. And I think Tommy Tremble's one of those unique players too, Scott, that I think is going to be valued a great deal, because we talk about versatility, right? He can line up as a fullback. He can line up in the wing. He can block attach. But if he tests the way that I think he is, back to your question about the pro day, if he tests the way I think he's going to test, they're going to say, well, this is a guy we can even flex out, and we don't have to take him off the field and do a lot of different things with him. So that's why I think he's a guy that is going to end up being drafted much higher than people think based on his production or lack thereof, because again, he was sitting behind his first 2 years, a second-round pick, the number 1 tight end in last year's draft. And then this year he's sitting behind a guy that in 2 years is going to be the first tight end taken in the 2023 draft, and Michael Mayer. So this is a talented football player. And him, and to me, the other one is Ade Ogundeji is the other one who, if he's got in his length, 35+ inch arms, biggest wingspan at the
85
Senior Bowl.
7 feet.
It's just absurd. I mean, absurd. And very underrated production. Had 7 sacks this year, led Notre Dame's defense. Very stout run defender. To me, was more productive in college his senior year than Khalid Kareem was, who was a 5th-round pick. And if Khalid Kareem doesn't have an injured shoulder that required surgery in January, he's probably drafted higher than early 5th round. To me, Ade Ogundeji was an even better player this year than Khalid Kareem was in his last year. So that's the 4th of that defensive end group that we talked about that's going to be playing in the National Football League. But he has to test well, and I'm curious to see how he's going to run, what his agility and explosiveness numbers are going to look like. If they are what people tell me they are going to be, and I don't know, then he's another guy that you could start seeing slowly start to creep up as people start looking back and diving into the film saying, hey, this guy was a really, really good football player on a really good defense for a lot of years. He just was backing up another guy that's now getting paid to play pro football.
Well, I'm going to jump back to the tight ends for 1 second. Then I got one more question for you, and I'll let you go. In my 15 years ago, my hypothesis on why there were no tight ends from the South is because if they're big and fast, they play defense in the South. Now, who wants to play defense? You're not allowed to cover. You're not allowed to tackle. You're not allowed to hit the quarterback. So I think the way the game is evolving, those big athletes, I want to go play offense. So it's going to be harder and harder to get kids to play defense when you're not letting them play defense. So that's another discussion.
And tight ends are going to start getting paid more. I mean, that's what we're seeing too. Tight ends are starting to get big time money, and that's say, hey, well, look, I could be one of a million defensive ends, or I could be a unique player at tight end and go make myself a lot of money. Like Eric Gilbert from last year's recruiting class.
Tight end.
Yeah, I mean, you look at Eric Gilbert from last year's recruiting class. I thought he was a better defensive player than he was an offensive player, but he wants to play tight end because that's a position now that's getting the ball a lot more. So
I used to try and steer kids with rankings and stuff. I'm like, man, go play defense. Not anymore, man. Not anymore. They don't let you play defense anymore.
You can play somewhere to get the ball. That's where the money is. I mean, that's just a fact.
Finally, one last thing I want to go, and we're going to go to irishbreakdown.com for much more of this because this is longer than a 5-minute discussion. But we talked about 13 guys. We didn't talk about here, but at the opening you said there were 13 guys that could possibly get drafted. And that probably means at least 13 are going to be signed to contracts, to pro contracts, to try and make a camp or whatnot. Anyway, long story short, that's a lot of talent leaving, including 4 offensive linemen, including your all-time winningest quarterback and second leading passer of all time, including your playmaker on defense. How does Notre Dame reload, and are they poised to make another run for the college football playoff in 2021?
I think so. I think it's really going to come down to, are they willing to make the necessary scheme changes on offense? We saw LSU kind of just be good enough, but to be in the conversation, but never be good enough to get over the hump. Because why? They couldn't score with Alabama, with Clemson, with those they couldn't even score with Notre Dame when they lost to Notre Dame twice in bowl games. Right. So they make the change, they open things up, and boom, they go from 32 points a game to 49 points a game with the same players. Right now, Notre Dame doesn't have Joe Burrow, but they don't need to score 50 points.
There wasn't there.
No, there wasn't. Joe Burrow started the year before.
To me, it felt like Joe Burrow was only there one year. Maybe that was
because it was a different version of Joe Burrow. He threw 19 touchdowns and 5 interceptions the year before for LSU. And so it's amazing what building a scheme that allows your players to go out there and play to their ability. So I think if they make those changes, I like Jack Cohn at quarterback, the Wisconsin transfer. Notre Dame has recruited the offensive line in a way where it's like, if you should still at least be good there. Their dynamic running back, Kyron Williams and Chris Tyree at running back should be outstanding. And I think now my big beef on offense was you have these really talented young receivers, use them. Well, now you have no choice. You don't have veteran players. And, of course, Michael Mayer, in my opinion, is going to be the best tight end in the draft next year. And Notre Dame has been losing defensive players year after year after year, and they're still good. They lose, Jerry Tillery, and they're even better on defense next year. Last year, they lost Khalid Kareem and Julian Aguara. They lost Jalen Elliott. They lost Troy Pride, and they lost Alohi Gilman, all guys in the NFL now, and their defense was even better this year than it was last year. They've recruited and developed in a way on defense, and then you bring in Marcus Freeman to replace Clark Lee, which is exciting. And there's a lot of young talent that was just not ready last year on defense that will be now. I think not having spring ball hurt that group last year. So there's a lot of depth, a lot of talent. There's still, though, a lot of what ifs, but I think Notre Dame is at the point now where those what ifs are hitting now more and more and more. There were a lot of what ifs last year, and those what ifs became, at the very least, solid, productive players. There's a lot of guys in place. And a year from now, you and I are going to be sitting here talking about Isaiah Foskey. We're going to talk about Michael Mayer. We're going to be talking about these guys that are getting ready to go in the NFL next year. Kyle Hamilton, first-round pick. So there are some elite athletes that they're building around. And when you can build around those kind of players and you've recruited well, because, look, they don't get top 5 classes, but every year they're in that 10 to 12 range. Every year, you're going to have a talented roster.
One of my recruitisms forever was you don't have to have the best talent. You just have to have enough.
Right.
It's going to come down to scheme and development. And frankly, having a guy for 5 years, a 4-star guy for 5 years is better than having a 5-star guy for 3 years, most of the time, especially in the trenches. Brian, I want to plug the places we can find you. irishbreakdown.com. We'll put your Twitter handle in the comments section on this, so make sure you can find you. And I'll also link your YouTube page where you're breaking down all this stuff all the time. Lots of people that came in, and I want to make sure that you guys are commenting and asking questions. We'll jump back and check them. I want to thank Brian for being here today and talking Notre Dame football. We will definitely do this again. And everybody
Anytime.
watching, and like I said, when you've got your comments, hit that subscribe button, and we'll make sure we'll answer them. So thanks, everybody. Thanks, Bryan, and we'll talk to everybody soon.
Thanks for having me on, Scott.